Hello, welcome to the latest video lesson, this time focusing on one of the lesser themes in Inspector Calls, that's gender. Before I continue though, a shout out for all the other videos you can view on mrhonline.co.uk. That's Mr H Online, that's me. A whole range of texts and themes within texts and questions and character and plot and so on. Okay, so without further ado, let's push on. Gender. So relevance to the play. Well, in the opening stage directions, I keep banging on about using stage directions in any answer in this question in the exam. Even like the theme of gender. So I'll point to Priestley's instructions about the lighting. So the lighting should be pink at the start. He says it should become brighter and harder when the inspector arrives, but at the start it should be pink. Now, one interpretation could be that at this point in the play, the family, Sheila in particular, see the world very much through rose-tinted glasses. That's an expression that means you don't really see things as they really are. But it could also reflect that neither do we, the audience, see the family as they truly are. It could, that says cold, I've got the cold. It could also imply that as pink is traditionally a more feminine colour, this is going to be a play about women. So the lighting should be pink and intimate. The intimate just reflects maybe the celebratory feel of the evening. So a little bit further on, in the stage directions at the start. At rise of curtain, the four Burlings and Gerald are seated at the table, with Arthur Burling at one end and his wife at the other. So continuing the idea that this will be a play about women, here we see Priestley's intentions to highlight not only the distance or separation within the Burlings' marriage perhaps, but also the inequality between men and women, with such a large gap representing their differing status within society. Okay, well, we'll develop those points as we go. Relevance to the play continued. I've just picked a quotation from the inspector. He says it to Mr. Burling. And you think women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things? So the inspector says this: Arthur Burling has just tried to get his wife and daughter to go to the other room whilst the men talk serious matters. So Priestley explores gender through how the male characters treat both the upper class Mrs. Burling and in particular the lower class Eva Smith, and also through how Mrs. Burling and Sheila reflect conflicting ideas about how they feel they should be treated. Okay, pause that, make a note of that. I'll explain that further as we go. Okay, so a bit of context and background to maybe Priestley's intentions and where he was coming from with writing this play. So I've got the split years there: 1912 when the play was set, 1945 when it was written. So what was life like in 1912? So the First World War would start in 2 years. Burling's optimistic view that there would not be a war is completely wrong. Dramatic irony is obviously the technique we know as an audience. What actually happened? Obviously in 1912 he claimed that the Titanic was absolutely unsinkable when in fact it sank on its maiden voyage. But by 1945 the Second World War ended. People were recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger and uncertainty. In 1912 there were strong distinctions between the upper and lower classes. Not by 1945 class distinctions had been greatly reduced as a result of 2 world wars. Back in 1912, and this is more pertinent to the gender theme, women were subservient to men. All well-off women could do was get married. A poor woman was seen as cheap labour. But as a result of the wars, women had earned a more valued place in society. And the upshot of all of this, but in 1912 the ruling classes saw no need to change the status quo, so they're quite happy to keep things as they were, as they would. But by 1945 there was a great desire for social change. Immediately after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide victory over Winston Churchill and the Conservatives. Such was the appetite for change. Priestley, remember, he was an active socialist and leading voice calling for social reform. He was a member of the Common Welfare Party, which merged with the Labour Party in 1945 and went on to that big election win. It is the ideals of socialism that are presented in a positive light in the play, as far more liberal and progressive, benefiting the wider community in a way that the capitalist attitudes do not. Priestley was influential in developing the idea of the welfare state, which began to be put into place at the end of the war. Priestley deliberately set his play in 1912 because the date represented an era when all was very different from the time he was writing. In 1912, rigid class and gender boundaries seemed to ensure that nothing would change. Yet by 1945, and after having endured 2 world wars, most of those class and gender divisions had been breached. Priestley wanted to make the most of these changes. Through his play, he encourages people to seize the opportunity the end of the war had given them to build a better, more caring society. So that's plenty of background. How does each, before we focus on some quotations, how does each character link to the theme? Okay, so Arthur Burling, he takes a traditional view on the roles of men and women. He treats his daughter like a little girl, is very dismissive of the women who work for him, upon whose hard work for low pay he's accrued a large wealth. Does not think women should be exposed to unpleasant things, nor should they be able to discuss current affairs, which should remain the domain of the men. Sybil, his wife, tells Sheila that wives must accept coming second place to their husband's work, expects her husband to take command, is content to play this role. We'll explore that a little bit further later. Eric admits that he's exploited Eva but feels guilty about it, which is in his defence. He hasn't lived up to his father's expectations of what a man should do or be. His father constantly belittles him, and you get the impression that Gerald is the son that Arthur Burling would have much rather had. Eric does defend Eva's request for a pay rise, so challenging his men, his dad even, for simply wanting to better her own life, which is what he says his dad advises everyone should do, look after themselves. But then when it doesn't suit him, he shoots it down because he's got the power to do so. Sheila doesn't accept her mother's attitude and asserts herself. Okay, so she doesn't believe that women of her position should play second fiddle to their husband's work. Like Eric, she also defends the girl that work in the factory. They're real people, as far as she's concerned, not just items to be exploited to gain even more wealth. Gerald has exploited Eva, while simultaneously demonstrating a huge lack of respect for Sheila. Moreover, he doesn't really believe he's done anything wrong, and he expects Sheila to take the engagement back at the end. He does treat Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as he knows her, compassionately, but ultimately he's abused his position over her. She's vulnerable, he's taken advantage, used her for as long as he likes, and then dropped her when he got bored. And so Eva Smith and her gender made her vulnerable and a victim. She is representative of all lower class women and their treatment at the hands of the upper classes. Remember, her name is important, Eva Smith. Smith, the most popular surname of the day. Eva could have a connection, reference to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Eve, first woman born, representing all of women. Okay, so some quotations. Mrs. Burling says to her daughter, "When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to it, just as I had." But Sheila's, and this is the time of the play at the start before the inspectors arrive, where Sheila doesn't come across as a strong-willed, independent character. But there is a hint here that there's a little bit of strength below the surface when she just simply says, "I don't believe I will." So this highlights a shifting attitudes towards being a woman, and an early hint that Sheila has more confidence and independence than first thought. But also that she's younger than Mrs. Burling, so she's the next generation, so she's prepared to step up a little bit more and challenge the behaviour of the men. Young and fresh and charming. This is Gerald's view of Eva Smith, Daisy Renton as he knows her. What does this say about how he views her? Young and fresh and charming. It's a little bit creepy if you ask me. Young and fresh and charming. I don't like how that comes across. But that's his view. And he's a upper class, confident, wealthy man about town. A girl of that sort would ever refuse money. This is Mrs. Burling expressing shock that a girl of that class wouldn't be interested in just money. Again, her prevalent attitudes towards a girl of that class. Very condescending. Continue at the quotations. We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. This is Mr. Burling's dismissive attitude to the several hundred women who worked in his factory, upon whose hard work he was completely dependent for his wealth. Now, Eric's response to that was simply, well, they couldn't get another job if there wasn't another job anywhere else. And that's the thing. There was such poverty and so many people looking for work and so few jobs that Arthur Burling was quite confident that he could keep his wages low, because the girls who were working for him were just thankful that they had a job of any description. the fact it didn't pay them enough to make ends meet was of no concern to Arthur Burling at all. Sheila challenges also, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Sheila defending her father's female workers and challenging her own father. Mrs. Burling, by contrast, the older generation, a girl in her position, her insinuation that Eva is of a lower moral makeup just because she's from the working classes. Eric's attitude towards women at the Palace Bar, his refusal to take no for an answer. I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. So he forced himself upon Eva Smith. He felt guilty retrospectively, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he, to all intents and purposes, raped her because he felt he had a right to. The inspector, just reversing a little bit, the young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back rooms. The inspector's portrayal of the reality of the difficult circumstances of Burling's workers, okay, and eliciting sympathy from the audience as a result. Oh yes, that's right. Just a comment about Eric turning nasty and forcing himself on Eva Smith. What does it say about society's attitude towards women that Burling believes the bigger crime is his son stealing from the business and not his rape of Eva Smith? You know, just an interesting point. It's just. And also worth noting that I think, you know, my own personal opinion, that Priestley does appear to give Eric an easy ride on this also, which maybe is reflective of equally poor attitudes towards women in 1945. Okay, and final screen as usual, exam relevance. So the theme of gender, that should be, not social gender. Obviously had social responsibility on the previous PowerPoint and forgot to delete social. So the theme of gender could be incorporated into any question on, obviously, the Burlings, Mrs. Burling and Sheila, but also how Arthur Burling treats her and how Arthur Burling treats both his wife and his daughter, and how Gerald Croft treats Sheila. The inspector and his role in highlighting the issues with gender, class and status, the generation gap, and what were the intentions behind Priestley's portrayal of the various female characters in the play. Right, that's your lot for gender. Check back on Mr. H online for a load more videos and see you there. Cheerio, bye.